Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage, APPIH, I welcome all of you. As you may remember from almost 2 years ago, we started a series of talks that overview careers of the seniors in the oil and gas and their perspective and advice for next generations. Today, we have a great honor to host Dr. Takin to overview his career and listen to his advice. Dr. Takin is an international oil and energy consultant with over 40 years of industry experience gained through a career spanning the Center for Global Energy Studies, the OPEC, and exploration, production, operation, and management at national and international oil and mining companies. He also has broad experience at the mineral and hydrocarbon exploration companies and regularly appears as a recognized expert in world media and at industry conferences. I will thank Dr. Takin for accepting our invitation, and without further delay, I'm transferring microphone to him for starting his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Takin.
Well, thank you, Dr. Samui. First of all, is the audio all right? Is the volume of my voice clear? Okay, then I can start. First of all, thank you and all the friends at APPIH for the invitation. It is my pleasure to join you and share with you, and I'll see what I can do. As you said in your introduction, it is not going to take a subject and go through it and prove and come at a conclusion. It is a broad view of the oil industry. In fact, it is to share with you how I evolved myself in my understanding of the oil industry in general. That is the industry, the business side of it, the oil market, OPEC, politics, etc. over these more than 50 years of working in oil inverted comma. And so let me, maybe I'll tell you something else, that when I first started to having worked in exploration production, I tried to broaden my horizon to understand what is oil and what is the oil business, oil market. And my understanding in the first 10 years was that is all conspiracy. And it is not in the hands of my manager or the boss of the company. It is at a much higher level global conspiracy, the price of oil and the oil business. Those of us who are remember the pre-revolution television series, the very interesting satire comedy Dijon Napoleon, and I'm sure many of the community have seen it afterwards, even as videos. I thought it was all Dijon Napoleon, it was all conspiracy. And I continued with this in the background, although I was systematically working and studying. But after a few years, I gradually begin to realize that it is not all theory and conspiracy, Dijon Napoleon. There is really basic economics, especially the price is subject to supply-demand of oil in the market. And I must say that a few years after that, then I begin to think that maybe it is not as simple, and began to look at the facts and the history, not emotionally, but numbers and papers and all this. And then more recently, really 30 years ago, there was a book prize, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by he in the prize, the author explains the history of the oil industry of over 1.5 centuries. And when I read that, it seemed at the time, and even if you look at it now, as part of the title goes as such, that oil is all money, power, and politics. I was dismayed when I read the book that it did not give Daniel Yergin, the author, did not give much or sufficient credit and acknowledgement to us, to geologists, engineers, and the technical people. I thought that was the weakness of the book. The first oil well famously known in Pennsylvania, Titus Well, in I think 1854, 74, anyway, in the last century, was 100 feet. And everybody all know that real oil wells are drilled thousands of feet in great depth. Also offshore, great depth. And exploration, seismic survey, and seismic interpretation has not done so much. Was it about 10, 15 years ago that they managed, that is the industry expert managed to get information and reflection from subsalt in the Gulf of Mexico and offshore Brazil. And that opened a huge realm of resources. So on and so forth, everybody knows. But again, continuing further and further on this, the role of politics, finance, technology, science, then the more recent 10 years or so, we have had the story of Enron. And hardworking engineer scientists, as I generally refer to the hardworking people who work, that became manipulated by power, finance, share positioning, casino games. Again, I don't have to repeat it. In our market, we had in the general stock market, we had Lehman Brothers.
I'm sorry, Dr. Takin, for interrupting.
Please,
Unfortunately, we are seeing the flyer. Would you please go to your slides?
Yes, very good idea.
I'm sorry to interrupting.
Thank you. It's a good suggestion. Sorry. But I thought it was still the beginning as the introduction, and I'm still at the beginning and the introduction. So this is the title page. Thank you, Dr. Samay, for reminding me. And this is the introductory note, the one that I was sharing with you. So from what I explained, which is really what you have on the screen, that I don't have a black and white and an interesting, simple model to explain to you what is behind the oil market and oil business. But we go step by step, and I think gradually, maybe I could admit that at the end, I leave it to you, the listeners, the audiences, to make your own decisions, if there can be a simple model found. And in fact, if you think of a simple model, please do share it with us before we leave. As you see on the screen, the outline of what I'm to say is really a chronological sense. And it is more my biography starting from the beginning. But in a simple grouping, I talk about my experiences from university going to oil industry exploration production operations, and then from operations going to oil market and policy analysis, which is the basics, what I share with you, which I've already summarized in my introduction. At the end, I will go to be something more tangible out of this talk to discuss the oil in the Middle East and the pros and cons, policy options, which I think will start a debate at the end. So the sort of stages which I told you, let's start from the first one, which is from university to oil industry operations. I returned to Iran in 1967. I admit myself, as put in this slide, as an arrogant graduate. I had done a PhD in geophysics in Cambridge, BS Honors Geology in Manchester. I spent a year at Columbia University, Lamont Geological Observatory, 3 months at sea in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, doing marine geophysics. I published many papers in international journals, and I was the top of the world in my own mind. But I went to Iran and started working in the exploration division of the International Oil Consortium. And I have to say that within a few weeks, I realized that all those universities, degrees, papers, attending conferences, etc., was okay. I don't want to downplay myself, but it was not what an oil industry operation man or woman would require. And I realized that I had to learn a great deal, even in exploration itself. And so I put my head down, quite humbly, worked with senior staff, took various courses, industry courses, and continued gradually improving myself, learning on the job and beginning to learn the various tricks and aspects of exploration, surface, subsurface, geophysics, interpretation, and then on and so forth. Which I think I would say I felt confident enough, having learned gradually. So I was prepared to take more senior positions, and at the end I became exploration manager of an American company. It was in fact Ultramar, which is technically was a British English company, but its operations headquarters in Mount Kisco, New York. Then I think which I had done sufficiently in my own mind at the time, in exploration side, I did an executive MBA in Tehran, and then I switched career. As you see in the slides, switching the career, I make it in red and highlighted. So the arrogant graduate starting exploration after a few years, then leaving and switching to something else, I changed into or moved into production because I realized the oil industry, at least for my own career sake, I had to be not only limited to exploration, I had to learn about production. And as I experienced from the beginning of my career, again, I had to be humble and start learning from the beginning. So I took training courses. An important part of it was with Shell production and reservoir engineering courses that Shell used to have for their own staff in The Hague. And joined them and helped the team on understanding Iranian fractured reservoirs. And I continued, and then I was put in charge of exploration, production, research of NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company. Now I have in this slide, as I'm sure you are looking at it, another red career change in 1981. But let me say, when I talk career change, it might give the impression that in my years, I have been very clever and planned and studied, made dynamic planning, dynamic computer modeling in order to choose what job and move from one to the other. They said that by no means it was like that. As it happened, of course, I was trying to look, improve, I was ready to take risks. But as it happened, I took the opportunities. So in 1981, my career change was to apply to the OPEC Secretariat in Vienna for a position which had been announced. And in order to prepare for the interview for this job, I started learning history of oil companies, relationships, and so on. So really, it is from 1981 that I moved out of E&P into this more oil business on a global basis, relationship of companies with governments. And there, I became more and more open. And this conspiracy theory, which I mentioned at the beginning, really became more prominent in my mind at that time. That I could not understand everything, and I thought it was sort of exploitation of the oil-producing countries by the big major oil companies, supported by their own home governments. The so-called conspiracy, if I can put it in that word, or you can call it something else. And in my mind at the time, I was also believed that the price of oil should be higher than what it was in 1981, which was about upper 20s or lower 30s, $30 a barrel. And I wasn't myself the only one that came to this by concluding, by reading these papers and analysis. There were publications, Harvard, Club of Rome, International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. These reputable organizations and authors were also had thick reports, analyses that the price of oil should be higher. So with this background in my mind, then I moved to Vienna later in 1981. And in Vienna, which is the center, which is the secretariat of OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, I started working as an analyst, as a staff, and I began to realize that because I had daily data of market prices, I realized that to my dismay, that I thought the price of oil should be higher, and all these think tanks and experts were also thinking, had been, say, 5 years before, say the price should be higher. What I saw in OPEC office was that there was downward pressure on the price of oil in the market, or whatever at that time were the key reference prices, which I don't think they were developed as much. But the information that we had at OPEC Secretariat trying to analyze, understand the world, I was a member of a large team. And the information was very clear to me that there was downward pressure on the price of oil in the world market. And this made me even more depressed. And I must say that in my first few months there, I really almost developed a depression. And the colleagues, especially Iranians who came, said, Manouchehr, are you mad? You are here. There is war going on in Iran. Get on with your job. I said, look, the world is putting all this against us as OPEC oil producers. Why are they so unfair? And I'm putting all these unusual expressions and feelings because it is exactly how I felt. But gradually, within, I think it took about a year or so, honestly, I didn't catch the story until about a year or so afterwards. I realized that economic principles and market forces were at work, and what was seeing the downward pressure on the price was because of that. There might have been conspiracy, etc., whatever. But if you remember that in late 1973, Arab oil embargo, so the price of oil went from about $2, $3 to $11. And then in 1979, 1980, various other reasons, the price of oil went up to more than 30, and some spot trades were at $40 and so on. Now, sitting back quite honestly and try to be fair, when the price of something rises fivefold and then a few years later rises threefold, there must be something happening. First of all, there must be a reaction to it. First is the consumers. The consumers, whatever, they're trying to save, they're trying to use less oil. And then, of course, oil being a strategic commodity, following the Arab oil embargo, politics came in, and various governments put together policies to reduce the use of oil, to encourage conservation, bring other energies, and so on and so forth. So it has been public policies as well as consumer response. And for ourselves, being operating people, another point which I realized was that the high prices for the previous, since 1974, almost 10 years, over these 10 years, oil companies had not have revenue. And they had money to spend for exploration. And because the price was high, they were ready to take risks. They went to areas that had been previously considered uncommercial. But they went, and being innovative, I can pat ourselves on our shoulder that the oil industry is clever and we can see challenges, and where we thought it was impossible to find oil and bring it on stream, they did. So early 1980s, there were oil production in countries which had never thought of 6 years ago. So this extra oil coming on the stream into the market outside OPEC areas was another force that supply was more and more, increasing at higher rate. And all these governments and companies were trying to sell, and the consumers, traders in the market wanted to buy oil, which is outside OPEC, because they always thought OPEC is risky, politicized, wrongly, I assume. And so there was less and less oil purchased from OPEC areas. And therefore, the demand for OPEC oil had been falling, or started to fall late 1970s and into 1980s. I want to show you this slide, that the four OPEC countries and non-OPEC countries. Let me go back. Because there was less oil being purchased from OPEC, OPEC ministers decided to do something. If they sell it, they keep selling it, then the price will come even further and further down. So what they did in response to the weak oil market conditions, and this is something I want to emphasize, is between the first 5 years, the first half of the 1980s, they cut their production in the stages. And they reduced their own production to keep the price up. And they kept on and on, as you saw in the slide, I will come back to it again. Their share fell more than 50%. And this was not sustainable. In spite of all the enthusiasm, and we are fighting the arrogant conspiracies against the OPEC countries, but they couldn't get the price back by cutting their own production. They were cutting themselves at the expense of non-OPEC countries, increasing their production. And in 1986, I think it was the year that they all started, some countries, to think what they should do. Could the OPEC countries continue cutting and cutting and cutting? And so, a little story here was that I was in Oxford Energy Seminar, and Saudi oil minister in September, being the last speaker, he said that Saudi Arabia cannot continue cutting its production and support OPEC policy. And he said that Saudi oil production, in order to defend the price, had fallen from 10 million barrels per day to 2.5 million barrels per day in July 1985, and that Saudi Arabia needed oil to keep its power generation going on, desalting, and air conditioning, and so on. So he said that Saudi Arabia would sell its oil at a market price. What the product prices in Rotterdam market are based on that. And no one believed it, and that was revolutionary. But I repeat this story. I was sitting in that seminar myself in September 1985. In fact, this is what he did, and that was the beginning of the change in OPEC policy. And so when the prices fell and fell, other countries joined after Saudi Arabia. And the price, which had been in $28, $29, $27 a barrel, depending on what crude we can talk about, came to less than $10. I think many of ourselves were in the industry at the time, different parts of the world. Oil companies were in crisis, huge redundancies, the companies were bankrupt, and this crisis in the oil industry came about. And it was a time that not only the management of the oil industries, but the politicians and others said something has to be done. The price of less than $10 a barrel is not sustainable, and it will collapse. The industry will collapse. Lots of activities went on. Political oil ministers having extra meeting, expert meeting, advisors, other universities, think tanks. Among one of these was the visit that US Vice President at the time, George Bush, made to Saudi Arabia and had an audience with the king. As you can see in the slide, after the conference, after his meeting, he said that in the meeting with the king, George Bush did not discuss the price of oil, and that U.S. believed in free market. The quotation that the USA, and they are still saying it. This is a slide saying that why OPEC had to do something, because its production had fallen by trying to defend the price of oil over these 5 years, and it stopped, because otherwise they would have cut and cut. And so we started increasing production, forgetting about the price. And as you can see, within a few years, its oil production began to rise. So I mentioned Bush's statement. I was working in OPEC Secretariat together with others, and we were called in the hierarchy of the organization and asked to do a study of world supply-demand balance, oil supply-demand balance, assuming a price of $18 a barrel. I've always said, what is $18, magic $18 came? And that is, I leave it to you, but I think it was George Bush's audience with the king. Although he denied it, they had discussed the price of oil. And somehow they had agreed that probably a price of 18 rather than 28, 29, they were trying to defend. Maybe 18 would be a price, which was a good compromise, the oil industry and OPEC countries. But I never saw any statement as to this agreement. As I mentioned, I'm repeating again, George Bush's denial. And it is that, which I put it in red, made me again think, so was the price of oil free market forces, which I was thinking, assuming and believing, I still believe it, or geopolitics playing a role as well. But now, I think I could make a broad brush statement that based on that analysis that we did, OPEC ministers had experts, kings, etc., prime ministers, presidents, and they agreed that, okay, they defend the price. But they said that they agreed, so they reached a conclusion, OPEC policymakers, that it is not the 13 members at the time who would be able to decide the price of oil. The price of oil should be decided by the market. And OPEC major producers who were at the time will try to stabilize it by lowering and increasing their production in order to stabilize the market. And I believe this policy has been successful since 1987. And they have continued, and the price is still going, the production has increased and increased. This is the OPEC, which had fallen, had continued and continued growing. And this is in order to, I don't want to take too much time to explain market price, etc. But over these years, OPEC has played a constructive role, I believe. I only highlight a few of them. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq, and the world embargoed Iraqi oil and Kuwaiti oil. So 5 million barrels per day disappeared. It was OPEC countries, as well as some others, who increased production and managed to get the price down from that to more normal levels. Then the 2008 financial crisis. Previous to that, as there was this boom in stock market, I think Alan Span, US Federal Reserve at the time, was saying irrational exuberance. That also followed the game that the traders were making in the oil market. So $147 a barrel was the price which was reached in July, one day in July 2008. It was not sustainable, and it fell, and it collapsed. And it was, again, OPEC countries that managed, by controlling their production, coordinating theirs to get the price of oil back again. And the same story has happened in here in 2014. In June 2014, the price of oil was $115. But the end of that year it became $80. And by 2000, going into January, February 2015, it came to about $40. Again, a sense of crisis, what to do. And OPEC did play a role. The same thing happened, I'll come to it later, for the corona, excuse me, and the economic collapse which occurred because of the closure of activity, transportation, etc. That's in order to put the market together. I think it was OPEC who managed to do it, who served a purpose for bringing stability to the market. Individual oil, major oil companies, independents, the US Department of Energy, Japanese, and others, they really would not have been able to do much. And it was these, the OPEC which did the job. And the last one, this continues, but that one I highlighted, the last one was after Corona, that the price of oil, the demand for oil was 100 million barrels per day in December 2019. By April 2020, demand for oil fell to 30 million barrels per day reduction in world oil consumption. Price collapsing. Who should do and help this? Again, it was OPEC. So President Trump and others who were very hostile towards OPEC the previous year. US Congress, who called OPEC on occasions, they are cartels and take legal action. They all came, please, pleading, do something. And so again, OPEC reacted and went on. These are a few examples, as I just mentioned here. I showed you already on the graph. So now I come to, again, myself. In 1990, I had another career change. I left the OPEC Secretariat because my term was fixed. I came to London and joined Sheikh Yamani's think tank, Center for Global Studies, and I continued, as you can see, I don't want to list it on the screen, various studies on production, cost, supply-demand balance, etc., etc. And in 2014, there was a career change. This career change was not in my hand because the CGS terminated its operations. And I can see I have continued still doing various jobs, of course, semi-retired, but I'm continuing as a student of oil, inverted comma, and as member of the technical group, Society of Petroleum Engineers, etc., as well as others. I continue this journey. And I think Dr. Samouhi kindly put it in the title page. I continued my journey in trying to understand oil, and this is what I try to share. Now, with all that, let's go back quickly to Middle East. Time is running out. But before we do that, we say, let's look at the history again in order to come back to Middle East and get some tangible base for discussion. I don't want to say to give you an answer, but the base for discussion. I realized that if we look at history, is that the oil concessionaires, these major companies who took and controlled the world oil scene for 100 years, their terms were unfair. Unfair not by emotionally or journalistic announcements and so on, looking at the terms of the contracts. They were unfair as to the revenue that the oil-producing countries would receive. They were also unfair when there were nationalization attempts by these oil-producing countries. And not only the oil companies, their own governments were also helping these companies. I would say companies and governments in collusion, standing against this. Maybe you disagree, but I said this was a sort of legacy of colonialism and imperialism. We have to accept that at least the first half or into the second half of the 20th century, this still existed. I add, as well as the unfair terms, that these oil concessionaires, these majors, they controlled and manipulated the market and maximized their own profits at the expense of oil producers who were not getting a fair share. But was it only as I said, Middle East at the beginning? It wasn't only the Middle East countries which this happened. But I want to say it as an introduction to the Middle East. But it was everywhere. It has been the story of the oil industry since the late 19th century. In the US, the excesses of the concessionaires, which I used in the previous slide, and these excesses by Rockefeller and so on, who used tricks, put competitors out of business, took the railways and monopolized transport and so on, led the US Congress to force the Standard Oil Trust to break itself into five in 1909. And the oil companies is within the US. But globally, the major companies were working everywhere. And because there could have been competition, or there was obviously inevitably a competition in 1928, the chief executive met in Scotland, apparently bird shooting, grouse shooting, etc. It was confidential. It became, of course, open afterwards in reports. It's called as-is agreement the companies made in 1928. And that was that they would not encroach each other's turf, so to speak. That Shell, BP, various American companies who had come out of Exxon, Gulf, others in Far East, Middle East, South America, and so on, they coordinate each other and also agree on the basis for the price. And there is a lot to discuss, but we don't have time. They accepted the US Gulf of Mexico base as the reference price. Based on that, they will all sell their oil to whatever, etc., etc. And again, I can tell you much more details and examples, etc. But the result was that for about 70 years, the price of oil had been kept for about $2.5, $3 a barrel for 70 years, while the price of everything else had changed over these almost 3/4 of a century. Manufactured goods had changed. There had been two wars, there had been recession, and the price of everything had gone up to 1970s. Manufactured goods and oil was still kept there. It was all because of these background working together. And one example of controlling the price was that after the Second World War, these companies agreed to keep the price low for European countries because they had to reconstruct Europe. One example. And coming further and further to a more recent time, the oil companies have been forming consortia. And one reason why they hold a consortium to operate in Kazakhstan here and there is that because the investments are huge and we can't afford it all, so we join together. Which may be true, but I think one way to look at it is that they want to share the risk. They want to be as all the largest major companies together when they negotiate with the government of whatever country in a very powerful position. So that country cannot really do much against this. And they can coordinate their operations around the world as members of that consortium. This is the price of oil which I mentioned over those years graphically. And here is one example which I came across last summer when I was working in the library in Tehran, that the Iranian Oil Consortium story. Iran nationalized its oil industry in 1951. And there was a coup d'etat, etc. We all know. 1954, an agreement was made by international oil companies, which as a consortium, they replaced Anglo-Iranian or Anglo-Persian oil company with later BP. And that consortium agreement was passed by the Iranian parliament and has operated for 20, 30 years or so. But one thing which at that time was confidential was that the majors, not all the independents and others, the major companies that were in that consortium, they had a confidential agreement to coordinate the production from Iran in order to be suitable with their own production around the world, all the majors which were members of the consortium. So the result was that the Iranian oil production had been kept low for about 20 years because of this consortium agreement and the confidential together discussion with the oil companies themselves. The U.S. Congress in early 1970s, as you know, the United States is a land of free market capitalism, etc. But there has always been movement against cartels, and still continues, as was the case against Standard Oil. They continued. Then early 1970s, the price of oil had jumped, and they made an investigation. As part of their investigations, they made the CEOs of these majors come to the Congress and be witness, and they did admit this. For the previous 20 years, they had been working together and controlling and managing the production of oil in Iran. And they continued doing it with the excuse of advantages of working in a consortia around the world. And this is the norm in these days. So I told you a lot about the past, etc., etc. There is a lot more to do. Time is running out. And I want to say that it is not always as simple and one-sided as I told you. The world is changing, everything is changing, and technology has changed. Oil companies have changed. The BP, these majors are different from what they used to be. The concessionaires exploiting, etc. And the world of oil, the world of energy has changed. And the Middle East and its position in the world is also changing. In fact, now we should be concerned that not only Middle East, overall, there is going to be decreasing demand for oil in the coming decades, or a slowdown in the growth of demand for oil in the coming decades. In fact, debate in these days, if you follow the literature, is peak oil demand. That world demand will reach a peak and then will be flat and then come down. And when the date of the peak is the discussion in these days. I put a note here about peak oil, which us as professionals have been exposed to it for about 100 years. That peak, and worry about the peak, was about peak oil supply, but now it's peak oil demand. The environmental discussion of the COP in December, I don't want to keep you about reading it, because the emphasis was agreement of the countries to reduce demand for oil, various means, put 1930, 1940, deadlines, targets, etc., CO2 emission, etc. So demand for oil coming down, and the demand for Middle East is in danger even more. Because in the last 10, 20 years, oil has been discovered in many parts of the world, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Guyana, and the United States, the US, that reached its peak in 10 million barrels per day in 1970, fell to 5 by 2005, was supposed to run out, and then there was a revolution, there was technology, again, thanks to yourselves, colleagues, all those, shale oil, etc. And so its production is now more than 13 million barrels per day. So demand for oil in general in the world is going down. Outside Middle East, there is growing. And so we are in desperate position as Middle East. But I want to say it is not really as bad. This will not occur immediately. But I'm talking about we because as professionals from the Middle East, Iranian heritage, we should be aware of it. But to calm ourselves down, I think we should. I think we should not be carried away by enthusiasts who support the environment, and the renewables will take time to reach so much as to replace oil. It will take longer, and the oil companies around the world, although the successes I told you, but generally they are under pressure even by our shareholders to diversify and not invest in E&P in oil. They go to gas and then even non-renewable energies in general. So it is not as bad than that, and then the world will still need Middle East oil. Nevertheless, I'm saying that we should not be complacent in the Middle East. It's not immediate crisis, but it could happen, and we should be aware of it, and be aware that we in the Middle East countries are using oil to get the current budget. Now, oil is an asset, is a resource. We should not replace it. So we are selling it, a dwindling asset. And we should not, we have been doing it for 50 years, 100 years, whatever, whenever the oil was discovered in Iran, 1908, in Iraq, 1927. But we shouldn't continue that. Especially, we should not do that for the future generation. And diversification is really imperative. And this reaching the peak demand and a fall in the demand for oil from Middle East and ourselves will occur. If not tomorrow, it will occur one day. And that is really my last point. And we have to tell the people we meet, convince ourselves not to continue enthusiastically closing our eyes. That people should be, managers should be. Now, individual countries, I think, let's look at Middle East. Everywhere outside Middle East, all the major producers have diversified. And I don't want to go one by one, and what Iran is doing, Saudi Arabia, etc. But that is inevitable. That policy is inevitable. I think I'll leave it here. And thank you for your attention. I think Dr. Samoy, I managed to do within the 45 minutes that you had asked me, and I'll be happy for discussion. As I said, I didn't give you a black and white, a simple model, a computer model or something for the world oil business, but I might have confused you further and further by going up, down, and back and forth. But whatever, I leave it to you. Maybe you can find, as I said at the beginning, a simple model and share with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate for great presentation. For sake of the time, I prefer to open the floor for any questions, discussion. Anybody that has a question, they can either type in the chat or unmute himself or herself and ask the questions. Maybe I can start. Oh, Dr. Gulay Darvish, please.
Salam arz mikanam. Greetings to you, Dr. Takin. Enjoyed the presentation very much. So, the question that came to me, I started working with NIC right after the war, so 1988. And there was this concept of siyanat or siyanat naft, or this conservation, I guess, still very much existed then, and I think it's carried through to NIOC. The statement that you said that apparently there was a policy by the majors for 20 years prior to that time to keep production of oil in Iran in particular low, to address, to be able to manage their production elsewhere. That was very interesting. Do you think now whether that concept of siyanat, which was translated into let's produce less so that we have it for future, that was really the way that word of conservation being used back then in Iran. We shouldn't be producing fast so that we can keep it for future. I just put the two together. Do you think there was some relationship between that mentality of which was instilled in all of us, all of the engineers? In fact, let's inject more gas, let's keep the pressure, let's produce less so that we keep it for future. Any thoughts?
Well, the second part of your question is that there was no relation between those two. The consortium agreement lasted for about 20 years. And when the US Congress made that decision, it became public. Of course, we in operation didn't read the story, but it was in public domain. And I think the Shah, Iranian government decision-maker knew it. And the fact that Iran changed or ended the agreement with the consortium in 1974 or so and made it into an oil service company rather than OSCO and rather than the oil consortium, maybe because of that. So that is by itself. But in general, the conservation is a sort of theme that all the oil-producing countries have against the contractor, the licensor in Texas who wants to maximize its production. The countries, the US government, the state want to make sure that they don't overproduce. But in spite of this awareness, for the last 40, 50 years in the US continent or US on land, there was overproduction, damaging to the reservoirs. And this idea of conservation started and has continued everywhere in all the producing countries. And the fact that oil is a non-replaceable resource has been discussed everywhere. And after the revolution, this idea of national feeling, etc., and now non-replaceable national resource became even the newspaper headlines, etc. And they said, let's do that. And I think it also became more prominent because during the war, I'm sure that it was one company, like the other consortium and others had left. Really, as national government, companies were thinking what to do. At the time, what you and colleagues were saying that because of the war, we were using and producing some oil fields at too high rate, because some other at the oil at the war front, they were closed down. And some people, your compatriots, were saying that, look, we are overproducing. It has to be this, in this, and that value, and we are only using this. So that was one case that it became in the domain. And then in general, the revolution and the fact that we have to conserve became more and more widespread. And it was in national news, etc. But that feeling was there. It is still there. It's everywhere. And there was debate. For example, the gas that you mentioned, people were saying, no, we should not. Gas, we should keep it, and we should not export it, and without emotionally. And we were saying that, others were saying that, look, we have this so much gas, the first, second, third in the world, and why not export it and get revenue? And unfortunately, with this motto and emotion, Iran has been left behind in its gas export trade. And there is that we can do it ourselves. We don't want foreign companies, et cetera, et cetera. It gets into that. So this conservation idea gets mixed up with politics and so on, which I think we have suffered because we could have had gas export projects for the last 20, 30, 25 years at least, after the ceasefire in Iraq in 1988. And we would have been a major player, a major source of revenue. Why Qatar? Why not ourselves, which have more or less the same results? So there are two aspects. The real case that we have to conserve a reservoir and not overproduces, as was experienced in Oklahoma, Texas, and so on for 40, 50 years. And in general, opportunities in the market. If we don't, we'll lose market. Thank you. That's all I could share with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Takin, this is Shane Mohammadi. I'm sorry my camera doesn't work. I wish I could show you myself, but I have a couple of questions for you. Thank you for a very expandable, sharing your experience with us. First question has to do with the world population. When we say the demand is going to go down, has there been any thought about the increasing world population, and then particularly in countries like India and China and all that, which if the price of oil is low enough, they can continue to use it. What's your opinion on that? And the second question I have is the replacement of oil with LNG. We know that LNG has, through technological development, has been expanding. Qatar is exporting close to 78 million tons a year of LNG worldwide. The U.S. Has proven reserves, or actually not proven, but the expected reserve of natural gas, 2,300 TCF. This is a mind-boggling number, and now is becoming the number one exporter of LNG in the world. So how do you think that the replacement of oil with LNG can continue to affect oil prices and the balance in the energy globally?
Pleasure. I don't have that answer, but I think I can give you some comments and leave you and other listeners to decide. See, for the rise in demand for in energy in general, what you raised is very important. Oil, the world population is growing, and economies are based on using energy. And so increase in use of energy consumption is inevitable and will continue. What is the debate in these days is replacing oil with something else which is more environmental friendly, non-renewable, solar, and so on, wind, or biofuels, etc., which you all know, hydrogen, and so on. But the demand is there. So hopefully, at least those who are very enthusiastic about green environment, is that these energies would provide the growing population in the world. These sources would provide energy for them, 6 billion, 7 billion, and we'll go on for the next. Well, the statistics and papers are there for look. But the fact that population is increasing is there, and they have to be fed, food, and also energy is there. But because of the concern about the environment, global warming, extremes of cold and wind, heat, and global Arctic ice, etc., melting. So reduce hydrocarbon and reduce oil. And so that is a separate issue. It really is not contradiction. It is there. As I mentioned at the beginning, the danger for us in the Middle East that no one will buy our oil. I said it's not as dangerous, it will not occur as quickly, and that applies to the world as well. That it remains to be seen how quickly renewable sources of energy can replace fossil fuels in general. Solar and hydrogen, biofuels, wind. The statistics are there, I won't bore you. They are still a very small percentage. But there have been improvements. Technology, as we say, has been revolutionizing our oil industry, medicine, communication has also improved there. The batteries in solar power, for solar energy, are quite different. They are, so solar power is electricity from solar power, photovoltaics are now almost competitive with the electricity generated by fossil fuels. So they will come, but it will take time. So I think I answered you on these two, on this issue. And LNG, whether we use it or not, that is part of the policy of each country. In general, in this debate about environment, oil is the bad boy. Gas is not as bad. The little brother, which was useless product, but if we used to burn it, it became useful, used, and so on. It is less damaging to the environment. So gas is supposed to be used as an interim when oil is gradually going down. But even that will gradually come to an end because it is a fossil fuel and generates CO2. But as to whether we use LNG or not, it depends on individual country, its resources, and its public policies. The United States was supposed to didn't have enough gas. And there were gas importing terminals, LNG importing terminals, built almost beginning to build in the 2000s, not very old. Different parts around the United States coast. Because the US was supposed to begin to import gas into large quantity, large volumes. And this revolution, these technological breakthroughs of fracking. So they went, you see, oil was produced from the source rock. And we used to, as engineers, geologists, find it in the reservoir rocks above. Some clever people went, look at this source rock itself, this shale. Has it and let its oil out? And some people say, no, they look at the logs, there was something, they tested and did fracking, they did some horizontal well and fracking. We know the story. And was successful. So it was because of that the US now has so much gas that instead of importing, all these imported terminals were converted into export, and then new export terminals have been built, Chernier, others, and you know, you are on location, you know better. Now that, whether continue exporting gas or not, that's US policy, competition between the governments. And when Russia invades in Central Europe, goes to Ukraine, and all these gas pipelines are cut off or sanctioned by the consumers. It is a wonderful opportunity for energy exporters to come and sell the LNG to Europe. So it is not a basic philosophical thing. It is an opportunity of commerce and business. How long it will continue or not depends on what happens, other sources coming. Maybe renewables will come within 5 years and put all the fossil fuels out of date. Maybe. So I don't have an answer as to LNG and oil competition. One has its own role and the other has its own.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sake of the time. I have to conclude this great webinar. And once again, I would love to thank Dr. Takin for accepting this invitation and having interesting talk and providing such important points. Plus, thank you all of the participants that find the time to take part in this event. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.